This one is called Less Least Gone by Jay Wilburn. The tale of King George the Generous and his Queen Victoria the Ruiner is told in many forms across many kingdoms and perhaps in other worlds. The actual details of George's fall are much more sinister than most people know. George was a new king, taking over from his elder father, who ruled hard but well for many, many decades. At the time George ascended the throne, few people remembered anyone other than his father as king. George held hearings with the people, guilds, and nobles to air their concerns about the kingdom. With the advice of his father's wise men, he changed very little in those first years. The queen was beloved, partly because Victoria was quite beautiful by the standards of the time. Partly she showed what looked like real concern on her face when peasants and commoners were allowed to complain. The former king's advisors thought that was marvelous. Faking real concern was an art most royals could never master. She would be quite an asset to George's reign. By the time they realized that her empathy was sincere, it was too late. She was also skilled at smelling out guile and dishonesty. She informed the king of their ill intent. Before they could silence her, they were cast out, imprisoned, or worse. Soon only she had his ear, and the rest of the kingdom had her ear and her heart. Victoria reminded George of his meeting with the farmers. She said they suffered under his father's taxes and could not profit from all their labor. George forgave the back taxes and lowered the yearly tribute to a fraction of their average production. The farmers profited. Farmers bought more land, hired more laborers, and produced more food for the kingdom. They even started trading excess crops on their own. In the end, this raised the income of the royal treasury rather than lowering it. Still, it was the principle of the thing. Those who appreciated the strength and tradition of the old ways did not like these changes. The queen next set about reforming the justice system. Judges appointed for their family reputations were removed, and other judges were appointed based on their wisdom and mercy. By the time she was finished, nobles who sought the aid of the courts did not know in advance how their cases would be decided, no matter how much money or power they had. This set the lives of the upper class into chaos. Next, she whispered her poisonous words into his ears about the plight of the poor. She first used her own wealth to pay off debts, to assist with livelihoods, to buy food when some could not afford it, even with the lower prices of the surplus. As her funds ran low, the people loved her to an unhealthy degree. Even George grew jealous of his wife, but she convinced him that nothing stopped him from being generous as well. No harm came from using his treasury to make the lives of others better, especially under the eyes of God. George fell for this, and the social programs of his wife that so greatly disturbed the order of things and ignited the dreams and desires of the lower class were expanded. I found a typo. All right. In time, former beggars had businesses of their own. Merchants accumulated great wealth and started buying property out from under the nobility. In time, the nobles were taking loans from former peasants, and the courts of the devious Queen Victoria forced them to pay back those loans. She started to concern herself with the well-being of peoples in the territories outside the kingdom proper. This brought protest even from the rising classes of people she had helped. The queen pointed out that the kingdom had a surplus of food and that others could be kept from starving with it. She demonstrated that extending the aid built up trade and actually paid better returns. That quieted most, but the nobility did not care that her economics were sound. It was her disrespect for the way of things that could not be tolerated. When aid was slowed or interrupted by the interference of the nobles, she sold her own dresses and possessions to cover the cost of distribution in the meantime. When those funds ran short, some of the merchants and farmers delivered the goods anyway out of appreciation for their queen. When the nobility tried to interfere further, some of the lower classes who held liens on the estates called the debts in and put the nobles out of their houses. That put the nobles on their heels, in fear of involving themselves any further. In time, the king sold his possessions as well. He even gave the queen permission to sell items from the palace that had been sitting in their spots undisturbed for generations. These unique pieces fetched high prices from around the world and sustained the royal couple's efforts for some time. As times grew tough and their friends had less to lend, the king and queen sold off more and more to sustain their work. Others had to take care of themselves, so the burden fell almost solely on the couple's heads. This was the opportunity the surviving nobility needed. They sowed discord, which was not difficult to do when people had gotten used to plenty and were now dealing with shortages. It nearly grew into a civil war that George probably could have won if he took on the strategy of his father. The military was on his side. However, Victoria suggested that being king and queen was not as important as the other things they did with their own funds. They negotiated a truce and were granted generous land and a stipend for passing the crown to another family better loved by the nobility. You might have expected that they would be imprisoned for their behavior or even put to death to set an example for the future. But the reality is that no king wants to promote the idea that any king should suffer even in defeat. It is not in their best interest to put such an idea in people's heads. The couple moved out of the city to their country estate as the new royal family took power. George and his troublesome wife did much of the work on the estate themselves, but many were willing to help for Victoria's generous wages. The new king tried to return to the old ways, but found that turning the wheel of society backward to a previous state of affairs was harder than he and his supporters anticipated. When the nobility tried to turn on him, he turned to the people to get them on his side. George and Victoria were largely forgotten in these new conflicts in politics. Victoria suggested the cost of maintaining the estate was more than they needed. They sold off the land and lived in a smaller cottage. When the new king died, his young son took over, and George's stipend was ended. Victoria assured him they would be fine. In time, they found themselves working for merchants in a town on the farthest border of the kingdom they used to rule. Again, Victoria assured George they would be fine. They earned enough to eat and live, and whatever extra they had, Victoria convinced George they could help others in need and would still be fine. In time, they moved to an even smaller hut outside the border town. As times and excessive profits grew lean again under the harsh rule of the young king, George and Victoria found less and less work. They had to hunt and fish for food. Sometimes they went hungry, but Victoria assured George they would, here I go again, one more typo, they would be fine. Better to find it now than when I try to publish it, I guess. After a season, as it started to be cold, their roof leaked, their cupboards were bare, they huddled together for warmth, and George fought a cough deep in his chest. Victoria asked if he regretted the life he had lived with her. He said there was nothing he remembered having. He wanted more than her. Thank you for the follow. I appreciate it. As they prepared to endure a harsh winter, faces they had not seen in years started to show up at the uneven door to their hut. They dropped off food, blankets, clothing, and other supplies. Others came and patched the roof. They reset the door. They repaired fences. They dug a new well. Others brought medicine and nursed George back to health. As Victoria looked for a way to thank them or to pay them back, they refused. Each of them to a person simply bowed to pay respect to their king and queen. In this way, George the Generous found himself the victim of Victoria the Ruiner. She lost his throne. She lost his kingdom. She took him to a humble hut to live out the rest of his days. They found themselves dependent upon the kindness of others. Unfortunately for George, they lived a very long time there together to remember all he used to have and all he gave up for her. Let that be a lesson to you all. Take heed, young men who would rule a kingdom. If you are not careful, you too could end your days just like George and his Victoria.